On their
Marrying you was
fifth
the biggest
anniversary
mistake
night,
of
the
my life.
billionaire
I should have
shoved his
married my
wife and
dog
snarled,
instead.
"Marrying
Then get ready
you
here,
was the
because I'll
biggest
teach you a
mistake
lesson
of
you'll
my
never
life.
forget."
I should have married my dog instead." She didn't cry. She just smiled and whispered, "Then get ready, because I'll teach you a lesson you'll never forget. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty wrap every woman in his endless mercy, blessing her with peace that silences every worry, strength that never bends, and a heart so radiant it lights every dark corner of this world. You are the heartbeat of love, the voice of compassion, and the gentle power that holds every home together. May your days overflow with blessings, your nights rest in safety, and your prayers rise straight to heaven. But my precious family, why do some of you watch in silence? It takes only a second to like one small comment to lift this family higher. YouTube may try to dim our flame, but faith and love will always burn brighter. This is Mission 1000 likes, a promise of unity, a stand of love, and a prayer of loyalty. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." There are nights when God himself looks away. The 5th anniversary of Stefani Taylor's marriage was one of them. The night the sky split open and the world learned that some kinds of cruelty don't need weapons, just words sharp enough to gut a soul. The penthouse windows rattled with thunder that sounded like artillery fire. Lightning turned the Manhattan skyline into a nightmare of white bone and black shadow, each flash revealing the city in frozen moments of terror. Stefani had spent 3 weeks preparing for this anniversary, handmade his favorite meal from scratch, wore the emerald dress that cost her 2 months of the household allowance. He monitored like a warden, counting rations to prisoners. Her hands had trembled while cooking, not from fear but from hope. That dangerous thing that refuses to die, even when you've buried it 1,000 times. But Jacob Duffy stood at those trembling windows with a glass of scotch. And when he finally turned around, his face carried the kind of disgust people reserve for things they've found rotting in dark places. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, opening in the earth, and Stefani felt her heart begin its slow descent into that darkness, even before he opened his mouth. "Do you know what torture is?" His voice was cold, surgical. It's not physical pain. It's having to wake up every morning next to someone who reminds you of every compromise principle, every moment of weakness, every time you settled for less than you deserved. Stefani stood frozen, the emerald dress suddenly feeling like a costume, like she was a child playing dress-up in a world that would never accept her. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she forced them still, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her shake. "I look at you," Jacob continued, swirling the scotch in his glass like he was discussing weather, "and I see every mistake I've ever made. Your cheap perfume that you think smells expensive. The way you hold a wine glass like someone who learned from television. How you say, 'Excuse me' to waiters like you're apologizing for existing. Because that's what you are, isn't it? An apology, a walking, breathing apology for taking up space in rooms you were never meant to enter. Jacob, please." Her voice came out strangled, small. "Please what? Please stop telling the truth? Please continue pretending that 5 years of this charade hasn't been slowly suffocating me." He laughed, and the sound was glass breaking. "My colleagues ask about you. How's your wife?" They say with that particular tone that really means, "How's your charity project going?" And I have to smile and pretend that marrying you wasn't the most humiliating decision of my life. The rain outside intensified, hammering the windows like it was trying to break through, to flood this moment and drown them both. Stefani's hands clenched at her sides, nails cutting crescents into her palms. She could taste copper in her mouth. She'd bitten her lip without realizing it. Blood mixing with the salt of tears she refused to let fall. "There are women at my firm," Jacob said, moving closer but not touching, never touching anymore. "Lauren with her Harvard Law degree, Christina who actually understands what I do for a living, Rebecca, whose father sits on boards that matter. Real women. Women who belong in this world. And then there's you, a girl from a neighborhood where dreams go to die, wearing a dress you probably think makes you look like you fit in. His phone rang. He answered it on speaker, not even bothering to move away from her. Patricia Duffy's voice filled the room like poison gas. Is she still there, Jacob? Yes, Mother. Well, get it over with. I've told you for 5 years that neighborhood bred nothing but parasites looking for a host. You've done your charity work. You've proven you're capable of mercy. But mercy has an expiration date, and frankly, you've let this go on far too long. Stefani felt something crack inside her chest, some final structural support giving way. But what rushed in to fill the space wasn't despair. It was something colder, harder, more ancient. 5 years, Patricia continued, her voice dripping with vindication. 5 years of pretending, of accommodating, of lowering our standards. Your father would be mortified. I'm mortified. In this tonight, Jacob. Fumigate, start fresh. Jacob hung up without saying goodbye. He looked at Stefani like she was furniture being appraised for disposal. You heard my mother? But let me be clearer than she was, because I think you need to understand the magnitude of what you are, what you've always been. You're not my wife. You're a mistake I made when I thought being noble mattered more than being selective. You're a coward who latched onto someone stronger and convinced yourself it was love when really it was just opportunism. You're weak, you're useless, and keeping you around has exhausted every charitable impulse I ever had. The rain outside roared like something alive and furious, like the sky itself was screaming at what it was witnessing. When Stefani finally spoke, her voice came from somewhere deep and irrevocable, somewhere that had been waiting in silence for this exact moment. You're going to remember this night for the rest of your life. Her words were quiet, but they carried weight that made Jacob's eyes narrow. You're going to wish to God you could take it back, that you could rewind time and choose differently. But you won't be able to, because I'm going to teach you a lesson that no Harvard degree or trust fund can prepare you for. And what lesson is that? Jacob sneered. How to survive on minimum wage. How to be grateful for scraps. No. Stefani moved toward the door, each step deliberate. I'm going to teach you the difference between mercy and weakness, between forgiveness and surrender, between a woman who loves you and a woman who's done being small for your comfort. You called me a coward. Watch what this coward does next. She opened the door to the hallway, and the sound of the storm rushed in like it had been waiting for an invitation. Don't come back, Jacob called after her, his voice already shifting toward uncertainty. I mean it. This is over. Stefani paused in the doorway, rain from the open stairwell door already reaching her, misting her face like tears. She refused to cry. She turned back, and when she looked at him, there was something in her eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't hate. It wasn't even anger. It was finality, the look of someone cutting ties so completely that the severed ends would never find each other again. You're right about one thing. This is over. But Jacob, the only mercy you're ever going to get is the mercy of finally understanding exactly what you destroyed. She walked out into a storm that had turned the streets into rushing rivers. Rain so violent it stripped paint from cars and tore branches from trees that had stood for decades. The wind screamed like something dying, like the world itself was ending in water and fury. Lightning cracked the sky open, and thunder followed like the earth was splitting apart. She didn't run. She walked, letting the deluge hammer her until she couldn't tell rain from tears, until the cold went so deep it stopped being cold and started being nothing at all. Her emerald dress clung to her like a second skin, ruined and perfect all at once. The fabric that had cost her 2 months of careful saving was destroyed within minutes, but she didn't care. Some things need to be destroyed before they can be transformed. Water rushed past her ankles, then her calves, the street flooding so fast that cars were beginning to stall. She walked past people huddled in doorways, past taxis with their hazard lights flashing, past the ordinary chaos of a city trying to survive a biblical storm. But Stefani wasn't trying to survive anymore. She was trying to be reborn. The rain that night killed 3 people in flash floods across the city. It destroyed homes and lives and certainties. It was the kind of rain that meteorologists would call unprecedented for years afterward. The kind that priests would quietly call biblical while looking at the sky with ancient fear. And somewhere in that drowning darkness, while thunder shook the foundations of buildings and lightning revealed the world in stuttering flashes of white terror, Stefani Taylor stopped being the woman who believed in goodness and became something the world wasn't ready. Bourdieu, a woman with nothing left to lose, a woman with everything left to prove, a woman who'd been baptized in cruelty and emerged from the water no longer afraid of drowning, because she'd learned something, crucial in that walk through the apocalyptic storm, that some things don't kill you. They just wash away everything weak, everything soft, everything that isn't strong enough to survive the end of the world. And what was left, what remained after the drowning, was iron. Chapter 2. The Hunger. Survival isn't noble. It's brutal and desperate and ugly, and it requires you to become someone your former self wouldn't recognize. Stefani learned this in the weeks after she left, when hunger became more real than hope, and the only warmth she felt came from her own rage. The room in Crown Heights smelled like mold and defeat. $75 a week. Shared bathroom, down a hallway that creaked like it was about to collapse. Neighbors who screamed through walls so thin you could hear their breathing. Stefani's roommates were ghosts haunting their own lives. Keisha, an emergency room nurse with dark circles under her eyes, who worked shifts that would kill most people and came home shaking from things she couldn't talk about. Paloma, a culinary student whose arms bore scars that told stories she never spoke aloud, who flinched at sudden movements and slept with a knife under her pillow. They didn't ask about the wedding ring tan line on Stefani's finger. They didn't ask why she woke up gasping every night, fighting invisible hands in the darkness. They understood that some things don't need explanation, because surviving means accepting that everyone carries wounds they can't show. The first week, Stefani cried herself to sleep on a mattress that smelled like other people's failures. The second week, she stopped crying because tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. They took energy she needed for walking miles to job interviews, for standing in lines at employment agencies where people looked through her like she was already invisible. By the third week, something had calcified inside her chest, something harder than grief and colder than despair. It was determination forged in the fire of having absolutely nothing left to lose. The community center in Brownsville hired her for minimum wage to teach art to children who'd seen more violence than most soldiers. The neighborhood was a war zone of poverty and forgotten promises, memorials on every corner for teenagers shot over nothing. Women who looked ancient at 30 because exhaustion ages you faster than time ever could. Men sitting on stoops with eyes that had stopped expecting anything good. Stefani walked past addicts, nodding off in doorways, past police tape around crime scenes that would be forgotten by evening news, past check-cashing places with bars on the windows and pawn shops selling wedding rings from marriages that didn't survive the bills. This was the world Jacob thought she'd escaped, the world he'd rescued her from like some hero in a story he'd written himself. He was wrong about the rescue. She'd never needed saving from this world. She'd needed saving from him. At the community center, children clustered around her like she was made of safety. They asked questions about colors and shapes, but really they were asking if beauty still existed in a world that seemed designed to crush it. She taught them to mix paints and sketch dreams, and when a little boy named Marcus drew his house with bars on all the windows, she didn't correct him. She just showed him how to add a sunrise behind it, Miss Stefani, why you always here? Don't you got somewhere better to be? A girl named Shanice asked one afternoon, her voice carrying that particular wisdom that comes from growing up too fast. This is the best place to be, Stephanie answered, and meant it. Because you're all here, but you could go anywhere. You talk different than us. You got that way about you that says you've seen something better. Shanice studied her with eyes that missed nothing. Why you choose to stay in a place that's trying to kill everybody? Stefani set down her paintbrush, gave the question the respect it deserved. Because leaving the people who need you most isn't strength. It's just another kind of surrender. I'm here because you deserve someone who shows up, who doesn't look at this neighborhood and see problems to escape from, but people worth investing in. You're not a charity case, Shanice. You're the future, and someone needs to act like they believe that. The girl nodded slowly, filing the answer away somewhere deep. You running from something, though. I can tell. People who running always work too hard, like if they stop moving, they're gonna remember something that hurts. Stephanie felt seen in a way that made her chest tight. Maybe, but I'd rather run towards something than away from it. I'm running toward who I'm supposed to become. At night, she sketched clothing designs on paper stolen from the center's supply closet. Dresses for women who worked double shifts and still wanted to feel powerful. Jackets that could survive subway commutes and still look intentional. Clothing that understood that real bodies don't match magazine standards. Her hands shook from hunger because she was eating one meal a day, saving money for fabric scraps and thread, building something from nothing while her stomach gnawed at itself. Meanwhile, across the river in Manhattan, Jacob celebrated with the kind of parties that appeared in society columns. He brought Lauren to benefits, a corporate lawyer with perfect teeth and a pedigree that included senators and old money. At gallery openings, Christina appeared on his arm, her family's name carved into buildings downtown. For weekend trips to the Catskills, Rebecca joined him. Her father's connections opening doors Jacob had spent his whole life trying to access. He told everyone the same rehearsed story at cocktail parties and business dinners, the words polished from repetition. My marriage was a philanthropic mistake, a well-intentioned experiment in social mixing that predictably failed. You can't manufacture compatibility from good intentions. Some people belong in certain worlds and others simply don't. His friends nodded approvingly. Gordon Whitmore with his inherited wealth and casual cruelty. Pierce Hamilton, who'd never worked a real job in his life. David Chen, who'd built his fortune on real estate deals that displaced the poor and called it progress. They raised their 18-year scotch and toasted Jacob's freedom, his return to their world, his restored good sense. Patricia Duffy hosted a dinner she called a liberation celebration, where she toasted her son's return to sanity and appropriate standards. The guests applauded. They all agreed that mercy toward the less fortunate was admirable, but had its limits, that Jacob had done more than most would by trying at all. Jacob's company announced record profits. He bought a Maserati in silver that reflected the city like liquid metal. He was photographed at a charity gala with Lauren on his arm, both of them smiling that particular smile of people who believe they're winning at life. The caption in the society pages read, "Bachelor entrepreneur Jacob Duffy enjoys the social season." He had it framed. He actually had it framed and hung it in his office where clients could see it. But in Crown Heights, while Jacob counted his victories and changed his women like he changed his imported shirts, Stefani Taylor was developing a hunger that went deeper than food or comfort or safety. It was the kind of hunger that could consume entire empires if you fed it long enough and aimed it right. She began to understand something that Jacob never could, something that his privilege had protected him from learning, that being underestimated is the greatest gift your enemies can give you. That invisibility is power when you're building something they can't see coming. That the world ignoring you means the world isn't watching when you sharpen your teeth. Late at night, Keisha would come home from the hospital, still wearing scrubs stained with other people's emergencies. She'd find Stefani sketching by lamplight, surrounded by designs that looked nothing like what wealthy people wore. "You really think anyone's going to buy clothes made by some girl in Crown Heights?" Keisha asked once. Not cruel, but genuinely curious. Stephanie looked up from a sketch of a dress that could transition from morning commute to evening confidence with one adjustment. "I'm not making clothes for them. I'm making clothes for us. For every woman who's been told she doesn't belong. Every woman who works 3 jobs and still wants to feel like she matters. Every woman who's been underestimated her entire life and is tired of apologizing for taking up space." Keisha studied her for a long moment. "You're either going to change the world or break trying." "Then I'll break." Stefani went back to sketching. "But I'll break forward, not backward." Paloma, who rarely spoke about her past or her plans or anything beyond the immediate moment of survival, paused in the kitchen doorway one night and said something that felt like prophecy. "You got the look." "What look?" Stefani asked. "The look of someone who's already died once. Nothing left to lose means nothing left to fear." Paloma's eyes carried knowledge earned in blood. "People like us, we're dangerous because we already survived the worst thing. Whatever comes next is just details." The hunger grew. Not for food, though Stephanie's stomach ached constantly. Not for comfort, though the room was cold and the mattress was thin. But for something else entirely, for vindication, for proof, for the satisfaction of showing everyone who'd written her off that they'd miscalculated badly. She would build something. She would rise. She would become impossible to ignore. And Jacob Duffy, surrounded by his temporary women and his hollow victories, had no idea that the storm he'd survived wasn't the one that came from the sky. It was the one he'd created in the woman he threw away. And that storm was just beginning to gather strength. Chapter 3. The Baptism in Blood. The second storm came on a Tuesday in October, 6 months after she left. The sky turned the color of infected flesh, and the rain fell like God's own artillery, and in the wreckage that followed, Stephanie Taylor would either become a corpse or a legend. There was no middle ground that night. The day had started with warnings that everyone ignored, meteorologists speaking in urgent tones about unprecedented pressure systems, showing radar images that looked like something malevolent bearing down on the city. They kept using words like catastrophic and life-threatening. But people in places like Brownsville don't get to stay home for weather. Bills don't pause for storms. Survival doesn't take weather days. Stefani had worked a double shift, teaching at the community center until 5, then taking the subway to Midtown to clean offices in buildings where people made more in an hour than she made in a month. She scrubbed toilets used by executives who'd never learned her name, emptied trash bins filled with half-eaten lunches that cost more than her daily food budget, and vacuumed carpets in boardrooms where decisions were made about people like her without her ever being in the room. By the time she finished, night had swallowed the city, and the sky looked wrong. Not just dark, but diseased, greenish-black clouds that seemed to pulse with something alive and malevolent. The air tasted like metal and electricity. The wind had picked up, hot and aggressive, shoving pedestrians off balance, sending trash cans rolling down sidewalks like tumbleweeds in an urban wasteland. The rain hit at exactly 9:17, and it didn't start gradually. It arrived like violence, like someone had taken a knife to heaven's belly and let everything bleed out at once. 1 second the air was thick and waiting, the next it was chaos. Water fell so hard and fast that walking became swimming, visibility dropping to arm's length, the world reduced to grey roar and fury. Within minutes, the streets transformed into rivers. Not puddles, rivers with currents strong enough to sweep people away. Water rose past ankles toward knees with terrifying speed, carrying debris that became projectiles. A shopping cart careened past, followed by scaffolding pieces, a mailbox torn from concrete. The city's infrastructure was utterly overwhelmed. Stephanie fought toward the subway, but water was already cascading down the stairs in waterfalls. Cars hydroplaned into each other, brake lights smearing red through the downpour like arterial spray. A trash can flew past her head. Thunder shook. The ground beneath her feet rattled in her chest cavity. Lightning cracked so close she could smell ozone, could feel her hair standing on end. A transformer exploded with a sound like a bomb, sending sparks cascading down like demonic fireworks, hissing as they hit the flooding water. The explosion turned 2 blocks into a strobe-lit hellscape. Lights in surrounding buildings flickered once, twice, then died, plunging entire blocks into darkness, punctuated only by lightning and the headlights of crashed cars. Then she heard it, the sound of metal crumpling, glass exploding. Through the curtain of water, she saw the black sedan wrapped around a streetlight, hood crushed like aluminum foil. The streetlight bent at an impossible angle, wires exposed and sparking. Smoke poured from the engine in thick clouds. And inside, through the spider-webbed windshield, a man slumped over the wheel, crimson streaming down his face in quantities that meant death was approaching. His head tilted at a wrong angle. One arm hung limp through the broken window, fingers twitching, the only sign of remaining life. Around the wreckage, people stood in doorways with phones out, recording, commenting, broadcasting to audiences who'd consume this tragedy tomorrow morning. Filming but not helping, watching but not acting. Their faces were illuminated by screens, blue light making them look corpse-like. Some narrated what they saw, others checked their view counts in real time. One person adjusted their angle for better framing. Another was eating from a bag, chewing while documenting someone's potential death. Something detonated in Stephanie's chest, cleaner and hotter than rage, more primal than anger. It was the accumulated fury of every time she'd been invisible, every time she'd been dismissed, every time someone had watched her suffer and done nothing. "How can you just stand there?" She was screaming before she knew she'd opened her mouth, her voice somehow cutting through the storm's roar. "He's dying right in front of you. He's bleeding out while you're getting footage. What's wrong with you? When did we stop being human?" No one moved. They kept filming, recording her now too, because outrage makes content. One person's face showed a slight smile, excited that the drama was escalating, that their video was improving. The rage that consumed her then was purer than anything she'd felt in months, more righteous, more necessary. She ran toward the wreck, feet splashing through water already calf-deep, her shoes filled instantly, dragging like anchors. She kicked them off mid-run, kept going barefoot through water probably filled with broken glass and chemicals. The car door was crumpled shut, metal compressed into shapes that defied physics, but she tore at it anyway, fingers finding impossible grip, pulling with strength that shouldn't exist in her malnourished frame. Her hands slipped once, twice, knuckles splitting open on jagged edges. Blood mixed with rain made her grip worse, but she kept pulling, kept screaming, kept refusing to accept that this man would die because everyone else had decided watching was easier than acting. The metal shrieked as it gave way, the sound, cutting through the storm like a wounded animal's last breath. The door tore partially open, not all the way, but enough for her to squeeze into a space that smelled like approaching death. The man was trapped, legs pinned by collapsed dashboard. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, mixing with blood and rain in a cocktail that meant imminent fire. The entire front had compressed, engine pushed back into the passenger compartment. The dashboard displayed spiderweb cracks. The steering wheel was bent. His legs were somewhere in that twisted metal. The engine ticked with residual heat. One spark and they both burned. Electrical wires crackled overhead, ozone and burning insulation mixing with rain. Broken glass covered everything, on seats, embedded in his clothes, in his hair like horrific glitter, covering the dashboard in a constellation of tiny razors. It sliced her palms, her forearms, turning her skin into a map of red lines. "Hey, stay with me!" She ripped off her jacket, the only warm thing she owned, and tore it into strips with her teeth because her hands were too slippery to grip properly. The fabric shredded, already weakened by months of wear. She packed the makeshift bandages against the gash in his head, applying pressure that made him groan. Good. Groaning meant alive, meant his body was still fighting. His eyes flickered, open, terrified, confused, already halfway to wherever people go when life drains too fast. They were grey, she noticed, like storm clouds, currently filled with primal fear that comes from understanding you're dying and being powerless to stop it. His pupils were different sizes, head injury, possible brain bleed. His breathing was shallow, rattling, each inhale possibly his last. "I need help!" Stefani screamed at the crowd, at the phones, at the universe itself. "Someone call an ambulance. Someone do something that isn't recording. He's dying. A human being is dying while you film it like entertainment." Her voice cracked, but still no one moved. They watched like she was performing theater, like his death would just be another video to scroll past. She could see their faces in lightning flashes, young and old, different races, different backgrounds. Some looked embarrassed, but didn't stop. Others looked defiant, like she was interfering. Most just looked blank. Humanity switched off, so she did it herself. Used her own phone with slick hands, had to wipe it on her soaked shirt, had to try 3 times before unlocking it. Finally reached 911. Gave the address through chattering teeth, while maintaining pressure on wounds barely visible through the deluge. The operator's voice was calm, professional, infuriating in its lack of urgency. "Help is coming. Stay on the line. Don't move him." "He's trapped! I can't move him!" Stefani shouted, then dropped the phone because she needed both hands. She held his hand while he convulsed, his whole body seizing as his brain tried to process trauma it wasn't designed to handle. His grip tightened slightly, barely perceptible. But there, still fighting, she whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, told him stories about surviving, because that's what you do. You tell the dying that living is still possible. "My name is Stephanie. You don't know me, but I need you to fight. Stay here, because I didn't walk away from my own hell just to watch you surrender to yours. You hear me? You don't get to quit tonight." His hand squeezed hers again. Acknowledgement, agreement, desperate hope. The ambulance took 13 minutes, and each one stretched into eternity. By the time the EMTs appeared, Stefani's arms were shaking with exhaustion, her clothes soaked in water and crimson equally. She'd stopped feeling cold because cold had become irrelevant. Her hands had gone numb, locked in position. The EMTs were professional, efficient, movements practiced and sure. They assessed everything in seconds: the trapped legs, the head wound, spinal injury possibilities, gasoline smell, exposed electrical wires. They worked to stabilize him while calling for extraction equipment. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, looked at Stephanie, at her torn clothing and fierce expression. "You probably saved his life. The head wound alone, 5 more minutes and he'd have bled out." They tried to send her away. She needed medical attention herself, family only beyond this point, but she'd gone somewhere beyond rules. She rode in the ambulance, refusing to release his hand because no one should die alone, because being human means showing up when everyone else walks away. In the ambulance, with sirens screaming and lights flashing, the EMT worked frantically. Started an IV, applied oxygen, checked vitals that were dropping too fast. The machines beeped urgently. Stefani whispered to the unconscious man, "Come on, you fought this long. Don't quit now." At the hospital, fluorescent lights revealed the full extent of damage. His face was carved open, body broken in ways that would require surgery and miracles. She looked like she'd walked through warfare. Crimson covered her clothes, matted in her hair. Glass glittered in her skin like deadly jewelry. Her feet were torn from running barefoot through flooded streets. A nurse approached with a wheelchair. "You need treatment." "I'm not leaving. Stephanie's voice was hoarse. "Not until I know he's alive." The nurse looked at her and saw something that made her step back, recognition of someone who'd made an unshakable decision, someone transformed by crisis and choice. "All right, there's a chair by the wall." For 3 days she haunted those halls, sleeping in chairs that left marks, eating vending machine crackers that tasted like cardboard, praying to gods she'd stop believing in. His staff arrived on the 2nd day, men in expensive suits who looked at her like she was a miracle they couldn't quite comprehend. "Who are you?" unasked, voice carrying awe and confusion. Someone who was there when it mattered. They told her she'd saved Matt Henry, billionaire developer, real estate magnate, man whose buildings defined half the Manhattan skyline. But she didn't care about his resume or bank account or influence. She cared that he was alive. She cared that one person didn't die in the rain because everyone else was too busy filming to be human. On the 4th day, when Matt Henry finally opened his eyes and saw her sitting there, gaunt and exhausted and fierce, he understood something that would change both their lives forever. That true power isn't money or status or buildings with your name on them. It's the willingness to run into burning hells when everyone else runs away. It's the courage to bleed for strangers while crowds stand and watch. It's the humanity to care when caring costs you everything. And he'd just met someone who embodied all of it. A woman, forged in storms and tempered in blood. Woman who'd already survived drowning once. A woman who knew exactly what it meant to be saved. Chapter C. For the resurrection. There are 2 kinds of investment in this world, the kind that expects return and the kind that recognizes value others are too blind to see. Matt Henry built his fortune on the first. With Stephanie Taylor, he was about to discover the second kind could burn down entire worlds and rebuild them from ashes. Matt Henry woke to pain that felt like his body was actively trying to reject existence. Every nerve screamed. Every breath was negotiated with broken ribs that felt like knives pressing into his lungs. But the first thing he saw wasn't the ceiling or the machines or the sterile prison of his hospital room. It was her. She sat in a chair by the window, backlit by morning light that made her look almost translucent, like she might disappear if he blinked. Her clothes were donated scrubs 3 sizes too large. Her hair needed washing. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept in geological time. But there was something in the way she held herself, spine straight despite exhaustion, hands folded in her lap with careful dignity, that made him think of iron wrapped in silk. And Matt felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with broken bones. He'd been married twice. Both times he'd been the one pursued. Women who saw his wealth before they saw him, who smiled at his potential rather than his person. He'd learned to recognize the calculation in their eyes, the way they assessed him like property to acquire. This woman had saved his life and sat vigil for days, and she was looking at him like he was just another person who needed help. No agenda, no angle. Just raw, inexplicable humanity. It terrified him in ways boardroom battles never had. "You're awake." Her voice was rough, scraped raw from screaming. "Good. I was starting to think you were too comfortable with dying." "Who?" His throat felt like broken glass grinding together.
"Who are you?"
"Someone who was there when it mattered." She stood, moved to his bedside with careful deliberation, like her body was running on fumes, but her will wouldn't let it quit. "Someone who decided you didn't get to quit that night." Memory returned in jagged fragments. The storm, the impact, being trapped and knowing fire was coming, someone screaming at the darkness. Her. She'd been screaming at people to be human, and when they wouldn't, she'd done it herself. Through the physical agony, Matt felt something else entirely, a debt so profound it felt like gravity shifting. "You saved my life." It wasn't a question. "I kept you alive until professionals arrived." "They saved your life. I just refused to let you die alone in the rain while people filmed it for entertainment." She picked up a cup of water, held the straw to his lips with steady hands, despite visible trembling in her fingers. "Drink. You've been unconscious for days. Your body needs to remember how to be alive." Over the following week, as his body began its reluctant crawl toward healing, Matt learned her story in pieces she offered like shards of broken glass, sharp enough to cut, but necessary for understanding the whole picture. She told him about Jacob, about the anniversary that ended in cruelty, about surviving on wages that barely covered food. She didn't tell it like a victim seeking sympathy. She told it like someone reporting facts. These things happened. She survived them. Moving forward was the only option. But Matt heard what she didn't say, understood what lived in the silences between words, recognized the particular kind of strength that comes from being broken and choosing to rebuild rather than surrender. "I want to help you," he said on the 8th day, when he could finally sit up without feeling like his spine was separating from his skull. His doctors had cleared him for conversations, though they warned him not to get agitated. But how could he not be agitated when this woman had given him a second chance at life and was planning to walk away with nothing? "You already have. You're breathing. That's enough." She was sketching something on the back of a hospital menu, her hands moving with practiced precision, despite exhaustion that made her movements slow. "What are you drawing?" She hesitated, protective instinct warring with something else. Then showed him a dress that somehow managed to look elegant and practical simultaneously, designed for a body that existed in the real world rather than on runways. The lines were confident, the proportions perfect, the vision clear. "You're talented. This is exceptional work." "I'm adequate." She took the sketch back, defensive walls rising. "It's just something I do to keep my hands busy. Means nothing." "No." Matt's voice carried the weight of someone who'd built fortunes from recognizing value others missed. "That's something you are. Adequate doesn't save strangers in storms. Adequate doesn't create beauty while living on scraps. Adequate accepts limitations and apologizes for existing. You're the opposite of adequate, and pretending otherwise insults both of us." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the exact moment she decided whether to trust him. Saw the calculation, the risk assessment, the internal debate about whether accepting help was strength or surrender. Her eyes held wariness earned through experience with men who offered help that came with invisible price tags. "I don't want charity. I've had enough of being someone's project, someone's good deed to feel virtuous about. Good, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership." He shifted in the bed, wincing through pain that would probably be permanent, scars that would mark him forever. "You saved my life. Not for reward, not for recognition, but because that's who you are fundamentally. I want to invest in that, in you, in whatever you're trying to build. Not because I owe you, but because betting on people who run into storms when everyone else runs away is the smartest investment I've ever made." "I have nothing. No credentials, no connections, no capital. I'm a woman from Crown Heights who teaches art to kids and cleans offices at night. My resume is survival, and that doesn't translate to fashion industry credibility. What exactly are you investing in?" "Exactly that." Matt's smile hurt his face, but he didn't care. "You understand something that every designer in Manhattan has forgotten, that real people don't live in magazines. They live in subways and double shifts and budgets that don't include dry cleaning. You know what they need because you are them. That's not a limitation. That's your competitive advantage. That's what makes you dangerous to every established brand that's been ignoring their actual customer base." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and doubt in equal measure. "Why?" Her voice was barely audible. "Why would you do this for me? What's the catch?" "There's no catch. I almost died in that car. I felt life leaving, felt myself giving up, and then you appeared screaming at death itself to back off. You reminded me that people still exist, who believe every life matters, even when no one's watching, even when there's no reward. That's rare. That's valuable beyond any monetary calculation. He paused, making sure she heard what he was really saying. I spent my whole life building things, making money, accumulating wins, and none of it mattered when I was trapped in that car. What mattered was that one person cared enough to bleed for a stranger. Let me return the favor. Let me invest in someone who deserves it, instead of someone who just knows how to pitch. The studio in Brooklyn came first, a space in a converted warehouse where light flooded through windows that had once watched factory. Workers build things with their hands. Matt provided connections to manufacturers who valued quality over pedigree, introduced her to fabric suppliers who respected vision over credentials. But he did it carefully, strategically, making sure every introduction came with context about her talent rather than his investment, ensuring people saw her work before they knew his involvement. I don't want them respecting you because of me, he explained when she asked why he wasn't leveraging his name more aggressively. I want them respecting you because your designs are undeniable. My money opens doors. Your talent keeps them open. There's a difference, and it matters. Iron Rose started small, sample pieces made on a machine Stefani ran herself, working hours that would destroy most people. She designed clothing for women whose bodies didn't match magazine standards, whose budgets didn't include words like couture, whose lives required clothes that could survive reality while still making them feel powerful. Each piece was tested rigorously. She'd wear them herself on subway commutes, wash them dozens of times, move through full days to ensure they could handle real life, not just runway walks. But she didn't just design from her studio. She went back to Crown Heights, to Brownsville, to neighborhoods that Manhattan pretended didn't exist. She set up makeshift displays in community centers, showed her designs to women who'd been told fashion wasn't for them, listened to what they needed, and built it. She'd spend hours in these spaces, watching how women moved, what they struggled with, what made them feel confident versus self-conscious. She took notes constantly, filling sketchbooks with observations about real bodies, real needs, real lives that the fashion industry had decided weren't worth acknowledging. The response was immediate and fierce. Women bought her designs with money saved from tips, from overtime, from sacrifices they'd made, because finally someone was making clothes for them instead of at them. Word spread through networks that society pages never covered, through church groups and subway conversations, through sister to sister and mother to daughter. Women would bring their friends, their daughters, their mothers, saying, "You have to see what she's doing. She's making clothes that understand us. Actually for us." Matt watched from a careful distance, providing resources but not control, offering guidance but never demanding direction. He'd spent his life commanding rooms and building empires, but with Stephanie, he did something he'd never done before. He stepped back and let someone else lead, watched her make decisions he wouldn't have made, respected that her way might be different but wasn't wrong, learned that partnership meant trusting someone else's instincts even when they contradicted his own. But something else was building too, something neither of them planned, but Matt couldn't stop even when he tried. At first, he told himself it was gratitude. She'd saved his life. Of course, he felt connected to her. Then he told himself it was admiration for her work ethic, her vision, her refusal to compromise. But late at night, alone in his penthouse that suddenly felt too empty, he'd catch himself thinking about the way she bit her lip when concentrating on a design, how she talked to herself while sketching, a quiet, running commentary she didn't know he could hear. The sound of her laugh when something genuinely surprised her. Not the polite laugh she used in meetings, but the real one that came from deep in her chest and made her eyes crinkle. He started finding excuses to be at the studio, checking on inventory that didn't need checking, reviewing contracts that his lawyers had already approved, standing near her workspace just to watch her hands move across fabric, creating something from nothing with a certainty he envied. His assistant noticed. His driver definitely noticed. Matt pretended he didn't notice them noticing, even as he felt increasingly transparent. "You're here again," Stephanie said one evening, without looking up from her work, a smile playing at her lips that suggested she understood exactly what was happening, just wanted to. There was a question about the manufacturer. Contracts? No, there wasn't, Raymond. Already told me you had him circle the block 3 times before coming up. She finally looked at him, and her expression was amused, knowing, not unkind. You could just say you wanted to visit. I'm not going to make you justify basic human interaction. Matt felt heat crawl up his neck. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, faced down hostile boards and aggressive competitors. But this woman made him feel like a teenager with his first crush, awkward and obvious, and completely out of his depth. I wanted to visit. Better. She went back to her sketching, but he caught the slight flush on her cheeks, the way her smile deepened just a fraction, and something in his chest pulled tight with a feeling he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Meanwhile, across the river in Manhattan, Jacob Duffy remained oblivious to the earthquake building beneath his feet. He continued his carousel of interchangeable women, his performance of recovered happiness, his carefully rehearsed story about mercy that had expired and liberation that felt like victory. He saw a brief mention in a business journal. New fashion line targets working women, backed by Matt Henry, but he didn't recognize the designer's name. The article was small, buried in the back pages, easy to dismiss. He was too busy with Lauren, who'd started making pointed comments about rings and timelines and whether he was serious about their future. Too busy with business deals that were starting to require explanations his partners found less convincing each time. Too busy performing success to notice it was slowly becoming a performance with no audience left to applaud. But in Brooklyn, in a warehouse filled with light and possibility and the sound of sewing machines bringing visions to life, Stephanie Taylor was building something that would eventually reach across that river and pull his entire world down into water so deep he'd drown before understanding how he got there. Success was coming. Slowly at first, like thunder too far away to worry about, but getting closer, always getting closer, and when it finally arrived, it would arrive like the storm that had nearly killed Matt Henry and baptized Stephanie Taylor. Sudden, overwhelming, impossible to survive if you weren't already strong enough to weather it. Matt watched her work, watched her build, watched her become, and understood with absolute clarity that he was falling in love with someone who didn't need him to be whole, but who made him want to be better than he'd ever been. And for the first time since his car wrapped around that streetlight, he felt grateful for the storm that had nearly ended his life, but had delivered something infinitely more valuable instead. A second chance, not just at living, but at learning what living actually meant. Chapter 5. The Infection. Reputation is a living thing. It spreads like disease or dies like a patient denied medicine. In the insulated world of Manhattan's elite, where whispers carry more weight than lawsuits, Jacob Duffy's infection was already spreading through the bloodstream of his carefully constructed life. Iron Rose exploded beyond every projection, and it didn't happen gradually, it erupted. A celebrity wore one of Stephanie's designs to an awards show, posted about it online, and the internet did what the internet does. It devoured the story whole. Within hours, thousands of people were searching for the designer who'd created a dress that looked like power distilled into fabric. They found more than fashion. They found a story that felt biblical, a woman abandoned by wealth, surviving on minimum wage, who'd saved a billionaire's life in a storm and was now building an empire from nothing but vision and refusal to quit. The narrative was perfect, the kind that spreads through culture like wildfire through dry grass. Magazines didn't just feature her clothes, they featured her survival. Articles appeared with headlines that sounded like scripture. The designer who rose from blood and rain, and building beauty from wreckage, and what it means to save a life and lose a marriage. They interviewed her about resilience, about clawing your way back from destruction. about what happens when you're discarded and choose to rebuild yourself into something impossible to ignore. Stefani never mentioned Jacob by name. That silence was deliberate, calculated, and more devastating than any accusation could be. She spoke about surviving cruelty, about leaving situations that diminished you, about learning that your value isn't determined by people who couldn't see it. She spoke in universals that everyone recognized as specifics. The articles included photos, Stefani in her studio, surrounded by designs. Stefani at the community center teaching children. Stefani standing beside Matt Henry at an opening, both of them looking at each other with a connection that cameras captured accidentally. The captions never explained their relationship because it didn't need explanation. You could see it in how he stood slightly behind her, supportive, not overshadowing. In how she touched his arm when making a point, casual and familiar. In how they moved around each other like planets in stable orbit. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, small cracks began appearing in Jacob Duffy's carefully constructed world. A major client, whose wife had met Stefani at a charity event years ago, had watched her navigate the room with grace, while Patricia Duffy made cutting remarks loud enough to overhear, quietly withdrew a contract. No dramatics, no explanation, just a polite letter citing philosophical differences. The account was worth 7 figures annually. When Jacob called to discuss it, the client's assistant said he was unavailable. When he tried again the next day, the number had been blocked. That's how thoroughly he'd been cut off. Not with confrontation, but with the kind of cold erasure that said he wasn't even worth the conversation. Another client's daughter, a fashion journalist who'd been following Iron Rose since its pop-up shop days, wrote a piece about men who destroy what they can't control. She never mentioned Jacob by name, but she quoted him, words he'd said at a party once, drunk and careless. Some women are for building futures with, others are for practicing on, until you figure out what you actually want. The quote was attributed to a Manhattan entrepreneur, but everyone in their circle knew exactly who she meant. The article circulated through group chats and email forwards, each share adding another nail to the coffin of his reputation. The quote went viral. Men who'd said similar things quietly deleted old posts and hoped no one remembered. Women who'd heard worse marked the article and passed it around like evidence finally being admitted to trial. Gordon Whitmore, Jacob's business partner, received an anonymous package containing every sexist email Jacob had sent over the past decade. Comments about female colleagues that ranged from dismissive to overtly cruel. Jokes about hiring practices that revealed exactly what he thought women were worth. Assessments of clients based on attractiveness rather than competence. One email chain discussed a potential hire. She's qualified, but looks like someone's disappointed mother. Pass. I don't pay people to make the office depressing. Another rated female employees on a scale, complete with crude commentary that made Gordon physically ill reading it. Gordon called an emergency meeting. His own daughter was a junior partner at the firm, and she'd been reading the emails with an expression that made Gordon realize how much he'd been ignoring. How many warning signs he'd dismissed as boys being boys. The look on her face, disappointment mixed with betrayal, would haunt him for months. "This is a liability," Gordon said, his voice cold and final. "Not just legal, moral. I have a daughter, Jacob. What message does it send if I keep you on after seeing how you actually think about women? What does it say about me that I've been your partner all this time and never questioned whether your success was built on respect or exploitation?" "Those emails are private. Someone broke the law accessing them." Jacob's voice carried desperation disguised as outrage. "No, someone held up a mirror. And I don't like what I'm seeing." Gordon stood. "I'm dissolving our partnership. You have 30 days to make arrangements." The news spread through their social circles like sickness. Patricia Duffy received a letter from a charity board she'd chaired for 16 years. Polite, professional, and absolutely final. Our organization prioritizes supporting women's dignity. Given recent associations, we feel it's best to explore new leadership. She called Jacob, voice shrill with panic and fury, demanding to know what he'd done, what that woman had said, how this was happening. But Stephanie hadn't said anything. That was the genius of it. She was just living loudly, succeeding visibly, and letting people draw their own conclusions about the man who'd thrown her away. Women who'd worked with Jacob started speaking up, not filing formal complaints, just sharing experiences in conversations that happened to include people who made decisions. How he'd dismissed their ideas in meetings, then presented the same concepts as his own. How he'd commented on their appearances instead of their work. How he'd made them feel small in thousand subtle ways that individually seemed minor but collectively created a portrait of someone fundamentally disrespectful. Lauren stopped returning his calls. She didn't ghost dramatically. She just became progressively less available until her absence felt permanent. When he finally tracked her down at a benefit, she looked at him with something close to pity and said, "I'm dating someone who doesn't need to tear others down to feel tall. I didn't realize that was an option until I met him." Christina, who'd seemed charmed by his attention just months ago, was suddenly seeing someone else, her Facebook relationship status updating without warning or explanation. Rebecca's father, who sat on boards Jacob needed access to, stopped taking his calls. His assistant delivered polite excuses that stopped even pretending to be believable. The country club membership came up for renewal. The letter suggested, gently, professionally, that perhaps it was time to explore other options. Invitations stopped arriving. The charity galas that had once cluttered his calendar went quiet. People he'd considered friends suddenly had conflicts, prior commitments, reasons why getting together wasn't possible right now. Jacob told himself it was temporary. He convinced himself that excellence always weathers storms, that lesser people were intimidated by his success, that this was just social posturing by people who didn't matter. He bought new suits, made reservations at exclusive restaurants, posted photos online of himself living well. But the photos looked increasingly desperate. The restaurants were empty in the background. The suits couldn't hide that he was dining alone. His company faced its first serious audit, not from law enforcement, from nervous investors who'd started asking uncomfortable questions. The findings weren't criminal, but they were damning. Questionable expenses, contracts awarded based on relationships rather than merit, shortcuts that worked only until someone looked closely. "This is fixable," Jacob insisted during the meeting with auditors, his voice too loud in the quiet room. "Every company has irregularities. This is normal." "No," the lead auditor said softly. "This is the difference between normal business and ethical business. You've been operating in the space between legal and right, and that space is getting smaller every day." Clients continued leaving. One by one, they found reasons. Budget constraints, strategic pivots, new directions that somehow didn't include him. His company, which had seemed invincible just a year ago, started feeling like a house with termites, still standing, but only until you looked closely at the foundations. At night, alone in his penthouse that suddenly felt too large and too empty, Jacob would search Stephanie's name online. He'd find article after article about her success, her vision, her rise from nothing to everything. The photos of her with Matt Henry, both of them looking at each other like they'd found something rare in a world full of counterfeits. He'd stare at her face in these photos, the same face he'd looked at with disgust on their anniversary, the same face he'd told was inadequate, unworthy, embarrassing, and he'd see something he'd never seen before. She looked free, genuinely, radiantly free, and Jacob Duffy, surrounded by possessions that were starting to feel like evidence of crimes he couldn't name, began to understand that he wasn't being attacked. He was being revealed, and what the light revealed wasn't someone others wanted destroyed. It was someone they wanted nothing to do with at all. Chapter 6. The Collapse. There, are two ways empires fall, explosively, all at once in rubble and screams, or slowly, one support beam at a time, until the whole structure realizes too late that there's nothing left holding it up. Jacob Duffy's empire chose the second way, which meant he got to watch every single moment of his own destruction. The call came on a Wednesday morning from someone who wouldn't identify themselves. Just a voice, professional and emotionless. You should look at your company's financial records from the past 5 years, particularly the consulting fees and expense accounts. Before someone else does, Jacob hung up, but the words burrowed into his skull like parasites. He spent 3 days poring over records, finding things he'd deliberately not looked at too closely before. Bribes disguised as consulting fees to people who'd never consulted on anything. Contracts awarded to friends, regardless of whether they were qualified or even capable. Expense accounts used like personal slush funds, dinners that cost thousands, trips to resorts, gifts for women who'd never worked for the company. Nothing quite illegal. Everything deeply, irredeemably unethical. Gordon Whitmore called a meeting. He brought his lawyer. That was the tell. When your partner brings a lawyer to a conversation, you're not having a conversation. You're being notified. I'm dissolving our partnership. Gordon's voice carried no warmth, no history, no acknowledgement of years of working together. Effective immediately. You can't just, I can, I am. Gordon slid papers across the table. The separation agreement is fair financially. But I'm done, Jacob. My daughter read those emails. She asked me if I knew what kind of man you were. And I realized I did know. I just hadn't cared enough to do anything about it. The press release went out that afternoon. Professionally vicious, irreconcilable differences in professional ethics and fundamental values. Every word chosen for maximum damage. Every phrase, an indictment that would follow Jacob into every future opportunity. The audit came next. Federal investigators with badges and subpoenas, combing through everything with the enthusiasm of people who'd found a target. They discovered what Jacob had known all along, but never bothered to hide properly. The pattern of questionable decisions. The blurred lines between business and personal. The systematic choosing of what was profitable over what was right. They brought boxes of documents, set up in his conference room like they were moving in permanently, asked questions that revealed they already knew the answers and were just building the case brick by brick. These findings aren't criminal, the investigator told him in a voice that suggested disappointment about that fact. But they'll be public record. And I think you'll find that sometimes the court of public opinion is harsher than any judge. The man was right. The findings leaked. They always leak, and the business press treated them like evidence of a pattern everyone had suspected but never confirmed. Articles appeared with headlines like, "The cost of cutting," "Corners and when," "Ethics become optional." His photo ran alongside. Terms like questionable practices and systematic abuse of trust. The investors fled first. Phone calls that started with, "We need to talk about the current situation," and ended with, "We're withdrawing our capital." Polite, professional, absolute. Money disappeared faster than water through open fingers. One investor, someone Jacob had considered a friend, left a voicemail that summed up the consensus. "I can't explain to my board why we're backing someone who treats people as disposable. The returns aren't worth the reputation cost." Clients followed. Major accounts that had seemed permanent suddenly weren't. They found reasons, budget reallocations, strategic shifts, new directions that somehow didn't include him. Some were honest about it. "Our board won't approve contracts with your firm given recent revelations." Most just disappeared, ghosting him like a bad relationship. Patricia Duffy called, her voice tight with fury, barely contained. "I've been removed from 3 charity boards. 3. Do you understand what you've done? I've spent decades building my reputation, and you've destroyed it in months." "I didn't do anything," Jacob said, hearing how pathetic it sounded even as the words left his mouth. "Exactly. You didn't do anything. You didn't treat your wife with respect. You didn't conduct your business ethically. You didn't care who you hurt as long as you got what you wanted. And now we're all paying for your arrogance." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was ice. "I'm removing you from family events. Don't call me again until you've figured out how to become someone I'd acknowledge as my son." The penthouse had to be sold. Not immediately. Jacob still had resources, still had savings, but the monthly fees exceeded what he could justify when clients were disappearing and investors were running. The realtor who'd sold it to him 3 years ago came back, her sympathy professional and practiced. "The market's good," she said, which was realtor speak, for the price might hurt, but at least it'll sell quickly. Moving day felt like funeral arrangements. Movers carried out furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The Italian leather couch, the handcrafted dining table, the art pieces he'd bought because someone told him they were important. It all looked like props now, set pieces from a play that had closed. The new place was a 2-bedroom in Queens. Not bad by normal standards. Most people would be grateful for the space, the natural light, the relative quiet. But Jacob wasn't most people. He was someone falling from a height where the ground kept getting closer and he couldn't figure out how to stop. Lauren called once, briefly. "I heard about the audit. I'm sorry things are difficult." Her voice carried no invitation for continued conversation, no suggestion that they might reconnect once this blew over. Just acknowledgement that something had ended. Someone was suffering, and she was glad she'd gotten out before the crash. Christina sent a text. "Best wishes moving forward." It read like a greeting card, selected for its inoffensiveness. Rebecca didn't bother with even that much. Just silence, absence, the ghost of what might have been if he'd been someone different. The country club membership lapsed. The letter was gentle but firm. "After careful consideration, we feel it's appropriate to explore new directions," which meant we don't want you here, and we're being polite about telling you to leave. Social invitations stopped arriving. The galas and benefits and gallery openings that had filled his calendar went quiet. People he'd considered friends suddenly had conflicts, emergencies, reasons why meeting up wasn't possible right now. Jacob tried forcing it once, showed up at a charity event he'd attended for years, even bought a ticket when the invitation didn't come. People were polite, distantly, carefully polite, like he was something contagious they couldn't risk getting too close to. Conversations ended when he approached. Groups dissolved when he joined them. By the end of the evening, he was standing alone near the bar, watching everyone else network and connect, realizing he'd become invisible. His company, what remained of it, operated out of a shared office space in Midtown, the kind of place where startups rented desks by the month, and everyone pretended their reduced circumstances were temporary stepping stones rather than final destinations. Jacob shared a floor with a crypto enthusiast who'd lost everything in a crash, a tech entrepreneur whose app had never quite launched, and a life coach who seemed to need coaching himself. The work that came in was small, boring, barely worth the effort. Consulting projects for clients who couldn't afford better. Contract work for companies that didn't care about quality, just price. Jacob, who'd once managed accounts worth millions, now wrote proposals for 5-figure projects and felt grateful when they said yes. At night, he'd search Stefani's name online. It was compulsive, destructive, like picking at a wound that wouldn't heal. He'd find new articles, new photos, new evidence of her ascending while he descended. Iron Rose had opened 12 stores. She'd launched a foundation. She'd been featured in magazines with words like revolutionary and visionary and inspiration. And always in the photos, Matt Henry stood nearby. Not possessive, not controlling, just present. Supporting her the way partners are supposed to, like her success was his pride rather than his competition. Jacob would stare at these photos until his eyes burned, trying to understand what had happened. When had the world turned? When had his story stopped being about his triumph and started being about his downfall? When had everyone decided he was the villain? But deep down, in places he refused to examine closely, Jacob knew the answer. It had always been like this. He'd just been too insulated, too privileged, too convinced of his own righteousness to notice. The world hadn't changed its opinion of him. It had just stopped being polite about it. His mother's final call came on a Tuesday morning. No warmth, no preamble. "I'm removing you from family photos at the club. People ask about you, and I have nothing to say that doesn't embarrass me. Figure out how to redeem yourself, or stop being my problem. Those are your options." She hung up before he could respond. Jacob sat in his queen's apartment, modest by any reasonable standard, humiliating by his own, and understood that he'd lost everything that mattered. Not the money, though that hurt. Not the success, though that stung. But the respect, the belonging, the certainty that he mattered to people beyond what he could provide. He was rich still, by most measures, but he was poor in ways that money couldn't fix. And Stephanie Taylor, who he'd called weak and useless and unworthy, was flying while he drowned. Chapter 7. The Recognition. Love is an earthquake that destroys foundations you didn't know you'd built on sand. For Matt Henry, falling in love with Stephanie Taylor was the first time in his carefully calculated life that he'd been willing to stand in the rubble and call it worth every fallen brick. It happened gradually, which was the only reason Matt didn't recognize it as falling. He'd been married twice, divorced twice, learned that love usually announced itself with fireworks that faded into disappointment. This was different, quieter, steadier, more like roots growing than lightning striking. He noticed how she remembered things, not just important things, everyone remembered those, but details that revealed she actually listened when people spoke. She knew his driver Raymond's daughter was applying to colleges, asked about it every time, remembered which schools had accepted her. She knew his attorney Marcus was training for a marathon, would inquire about his mileage and whether his knee was still bothering him. She treated every human being like they mattered equally, like dignity was distributed without regard to paychecks or titles. He'd noticed how she returned to the community center every Thursday evening, no matter how exhausted she was, no matter how many other obligations she had. She'd work through the day building her empire, then spend 2 hours teaching children that beauty still existed in a world designed to crush it. "Why do you keep going?" he asked once, watching her pack up supplies in her studio before heading to Brownsville. "Because someone kept showing up for me when I needed it. These kids need to know someone sees them, that they matter beyond what the world tells them they're worth." She looked at him, and her eyes carried weight that came from experience rather than theory. "You can't understand what it means to be invisible until someone finally looks at you and actually sees you. I want to be that person for them." He noticed how she navigated success without letting it change her core. Iron Rose was exploding, media attention was constant, opportunities were flooding in, and she remained somehow grounded. She didn't move to Manhattan or start dressing in designer labels. She stayed in Brooklyn, kept shopping at the same grocery store, still took the subway more often than cars. "Aren't you tired of the commute?" Matt asked, after watching her navigate 3 trains to reach her studio. "No more tired than everyone else taking these trains. The day I start thinking I'm above the subway is the day I forget who I'm designing for." She smiled, but it wasn't smug. It was genuinely content. Money's supposed to make your life easier, not make you forget where you came from. Matt had been wealthy his entire adult life, had built his fortune through calculated risks and strategic decisions, but he'd forgotten, if he'd ever known, what it felt like to move through the world without armor. Stephanie hadn't forgotten. She couldn't. And watching her maintain her humanity while building her empire taught him something business school never had, that staying connected to struggle isn't weakness. It's the only way to build something that matters. But it was the small moments that destroyed his defenses completely. The way she'd bring him coffee when he was working late, remembering he took it black with 1 sugar. How she'd argue with him about design decisions or business strategies, never deferring just because he had more experience or capital. The sound of her laugh when something genuinely amused her, not polite laughter for social situations, but real joy that started deep and bubbled up authentic. One evening, working late in her studio, she broke. Not crying, something deeper, more fundamental. She was staring at a design that wasn't working. And suddenly her hands were shaking, her breathing shallow, her whole body radiating exhaustion that went beyond physical. "I don't know if I deserve this." Her voice came out raw, stripped. "What if I'm fooling everyone? What if tomorrow they all wake up and realize I'm just a woman from Crown Heights who got lucky? What if this all falls apart because I'm building on nothing, on accident, on borrowed time?" Matt moved to her, not touching, because he wasn't sure he had permission, just being present. "You want to know about building on nothing?" His voice was gentle but carried weight from his own wounds. "I slept in my car for 3 months when I was 30. Lost my first business, lost my marriage, lost every cent I had. Sat there in that car thinking I'd peaked, that everything after would just be managing the fall. I'd wake up with frost on the windows, my breath visible in the air, and wonder if this was it, if this was as far as I'd get before the world broke me completely." Stefani looked at him, really looked, seeing past the success to the person who'd survived failure. "My second marriage imploded because I was trying to prove something to a father who died disappointed in me. I built an empire, and it meant nothing because I was building it for someone who couldn't see it anymore. I'd stand at the top of buildings I'd constructed, looking at the skyline I'd helped create, and feel absolutely empty because the person I was trying to impress was 6 feet underground and past caring." He paused, making sure she heard what he was saying. "Worth isn't something you deserve. It's something you build, brick by bloody brick, until the structure stands strong enough to shelter others. You're not fooling anyone. You're just finally showing them who you always were." Something shifted in the space between them. Recognition, understanding, the collision of two people who'd both learned that surviving makes you either bitter or better, and they'd chosen the same path. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. When he kissed her, it wasn't passionate. It was desperate, like someone who'd been holding his breath underwater and finally reached the surface, like finding solid ground after years of falling. His hands cupped her face with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity of the kiss, like he was holding something precious that might shatter if he gripped too hard. She kissed him back with equal intensity, equal need, equal relief at finding someone who understood that being broken first was sometimes the only way to build something genuine. Their relationship unfolded after that with the inevitability of seasons changing, natural, necessary, right in ways that couldn't be forced or faked. They appeared together at events, and the way they looked at each other told stories that words couldn't capture. How he'd touch her back while she spoke, not guiding but supporting. How she'd lean into him slightly, unconsciously, like her body knew where safety lived. How they'd share glances across rooms that carried entire conversations. The press noticed. Power couple redefining partnership appeared in business magazines alongside photos that captured something rare. Two people who'd survived their own hells, looking at each other like they'd finally found home. But it was the private moments that mattered more. Mornings in her brownstone kitchen, drinking coffee while rain tapped gently on windows. He'd learned she took hers with cream and too much sugar, that she liked to stand at the window watching the neighborhood wake up, that she was quietest in the morning before the world demanded performance. Evenings when they'd cook together, arguing about whether oregano or basil worked better, laughing when dinner burned because they'd gotten distracted by conversations that ranged from childhood wounds to dreams they'd stopped admitting they still carried. He discovered she hummed while chopping vegetables, that she arranged ingredients by color before cooking, that she tasted everything compulsively like she was conducting an experiment. She learned he was meticulous about measurements, that he couldn't cook without music playing, that he'd wash dishes as they went because chaos in the kitchen meant chaos in his head. Nights when they'd just sit, Not talking, just being, finding peace in shared silence. She'd sketch while he read contracts, their legs tangled on the couch, comfortable in ways that felt like coming home after being lost for years. Sometimes he'd look up and find her watching him, and she'd smile without embarrassment, without needing to explain why she was memorizing the way light caught his face. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," Stephanie admitted one evening, her head on his shoulder, while they watched the city lights through her window. "After Jacob, after everything, I thought that part of me was dead." It wasn't dead. It was just waiting for someone who wouldn't weaponize it. Matt's voice was quiet, certain. "You didn't lose your ability to trust. You just got better at recognizing who deserves it." In Queens, Jacob saw their photo in a waiting room magazine. 3 months old, dog-eared and coffee-stained. But the image was crystalline. Stephanie in a dress she'd designed, standing next to Matt Henry, both of them looking at each other like the rest of the world was just background noise. Her smile, that smile Jacob used to think he owned, used to take for granted, used to dismiss as inadequate, was directed at Matt with an intensity that said, "I choose you," in every pixel. Jacob stared at that photo until someone called his name for his interview. He went through the motions of answering questions, knowing he wouldn't get the job, unable to stop thinking about that smile. That night, alone in his apartment, he finally understood what he'd destroyed, not just a marriage, but the only person who'd ever loved him for who he was, rather than what he had. And she'd found someone who loved her the same way, except this time she was someone who'd learned her own worth and wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. The worst part wasn't that he'd lost her. The worst part was that he'd thrown her away deliberately, cruelly, thinking there would always be someone better waiting. And now he knew the truth. There wasn't anyone better. She was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and he'd destroyed it because he'd been too arrogant to recognize value when it was standing in front of him begging to be seen. Chapter 8. The Empire of Ashes. Some people build empires from gold and privilege. Others build them from rubble and rage. Stephanie Taylor's empire rose from both, the rubble of what she survived, the rage of refusing to let it define her limits. Iron Rose became more than a fashion company. It became a movement that transcended clothing and touched something raw in the culture. Stephanie's runway shows featured models of every size, every age, every ethnicity, real women with stretch marks and scars and stories written into their bodies. The clothes were designed for women who worked 3 jobs and still wanted dignity, who had budgets that didn't include dry cleaning, who needed fashion that understood reality, but she didn't stop at design. She opened a factory in Brooklyn that paid living wages and offered childcare, healthcare, profit sharing, things that cut into margins but built loyalty that numbers couldn't measure. She hired women coming out of difficult situations, single mothers who needed flexible schedules, people society had written off, who just needed someone to believe they were worth the investment. The media loved it. The designer who remembers where she came from, and building fashion that gives back, and Stephanie Taylor's revolution. They interviewed her constantly, and she used every platform to talk about survival, second chances, being discarded, and choosing to rebuild yourself into something they couldn't ignore. She never mentioned Jacob by name. That was strategic brilliance. By not attacking him directly, she let people draw their own conclusions. And those conclusions were devastating. She purchased a brownstone in Brooklyn, deliberately staying in the neighborhood that had sheltered her when she had nothing, refusing to abandon the community that had given her space to rebuild. She and Matt hosted dinners there for people who'd never seen the inside of wealth. Single mothers from the community center, teenagers from the art program, the EMTs who'd saved Matt's life that night in the storm. Matt had suggested a place in Manhattan initially. Something that made sense for business, for networking, for the life they were building. Stephanie had looked at him with something close to disappointment, and he'd immediately backtracked, realizing he'd slipped into old patterns, thinking about strategy instead of values, about appearance instead of authenticity. "I'm sorry," he'd said. "That was me thinking like a billionaire instead of thinking like your partner. You are a billionaire." "I know, but I don't want to be the kind who forgets that geography isn't just about real estate values. Brooklyn matters to you because it saw you when you were invisible. I need to be someone who understands that." She'd kissed him then, and he'd understood that loving her meant constantly choosing to be better than his instincts, to question his assumptions, to remember that his way wasn't the only way. It was humbling. It was necessary. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. "Why Brooklyn?" a journalist asked during an interview. "Why not Manhattan?" "Because Manhattan's where people go to forget where they came from. Brooklyn's where people go to remember why they survived." Stefani's answer was quoted in 1,000 articles afterward. She launched a foundation providing business training and startup capital for women escaping abusive relationships, called it Iron Rose Initiative, and staffed it with women who understood that survival was just the beginning, that rebuilding required resources and someone willing to believe your past didn't define your potential. Patricia Duffy reached out through an intermediary, a letter that arrived in expensive stationery with a return address that probably cost more than most people's rent. The letter apologized without expecting forgiveness, acknowledged harm without demanding absolution, admitted that her son had learned his cruelty from somewhere and she'd spent too many years teaching rather than correcting. Stefani read it once, filed it away. Maybe someday she'd respond. Maybe not. The letter wasn't about Patricia's redemption. It was about her own peace. And peace, Stefani had learned, didn't require reconciliation. Sometimes it just required distance. Meanwhile, Jacob's life continued its slow suffocation. His company closed completely. Not bankruptcy, just a quiet death, where he locked the doors one day and didn't come back. The shared office space stopped making sense when there was no work to do there. Gordon released a statement to Forbes when asked about the dissolution. "Some partnerships end because of disagreement. Others end because you realize you were never actually aligned on values in the first place." Every job interview ended the same way. Polite rejections, professional deflections, the sense that decisions had been made before he walked in the room. Nobody said it directly, but everyone understood. His reputation was toxic, and in a world where reputation mattered more than credentials, toxic was terminal. He moved again, this time to a studio apartment in Flushing. Smaller, cheaper, further from Manhattan and everything it represented. The neighborhood was louder, more crowded, more alive with the kind of struggling he'd once looked down on. Now he was part of it, just another person trying to make rent, wondering how things got so far off track. Patricia Duffy called one final time, her voice carrying a finality that felt like burial. "I'm removing you from family photos at the club. People ask about you, and I have nothing to say that doesn't humiliate me. Figure out how to redeem yourself, or accept that you're no longer someone I acknowledge. Those are your options." She hung up. Jacob tried calling back, but she'd blocked his number. His mother had erased him like he was a mistake in permanent ink, and she'd found correction fluid. On a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 1 year after the storm that had changed everything, Jacob found himself standing outside the community center in Brownsville. He didn't plan it. His feet just carried him there, following some instinct he didn't understand. Through the window, he watched Stefani teach children to paint. They crowded around her like she was made of safety and magic, asking questions about colors and techniques, but really asking if someone saw them, if they mattered, if beauty existed in a world designed to crush it. A little girl, maybe 7, showed Stefani a painting, crude, simple, heartfelt. "Is it good?" Stefani knelt down, eye level, and studied the painting like it was museum-worthy. "It's honest. That makes it better than good. It makes it real. When I grow up," the girl said, voice carrying conviction that could move mountains, "I want to be brave like you." Stefani's face did something that made Jacob's chest hurt. It softened and strengthened simultaneously, like she was absorbing the child's words and reflecting them back amplified. You already are brave. You're here. You're trying. You're creating beauty in a world that says you shouldn't matter. That's the definition of brave. You just have to remember it when people try to convince you otherwise. Jacob stood there, watching the woman he'd thrown away become someone's hero, someone's inspiration, someone's proof that cruelty doesn't win. And for the first time in his privileged life, he understood what poverty really meant, not lacking money, but lacking meaning. She had purpose that filled every corner of her existence. He had nothing but a resume of regrets and a future that stretched ahead empty of anything that mattered. The rain started, gentle this time, cleansing rather than destroying. Jacob walked away while Stefani continued teaching, her voice carrying through the window about colors and dreams and refusing to be small. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth seeing anymore. Chapter 9. The Storm Returns. There are confrontations that happen in courtrooms with lawyers present, and there are confrontations that happen in parking lots when the sky opens up and the rain returns, like it's been waiting for this exact moment to witness what cruelty finally looks like when it meets consequence face to face. The meteorologists had been warning about it for days, the worst storm of the decade. Pressure systems colliding in ways that created conditions they'd never seen before. Everyone urged to stay indoors and prepare for something biblical. The news showed footage of the last major storm, reminded people of the deaths, the destruction, the way nature could humble even the most arrogant city. But Jacob Duffy wasn't thinking about weather warnings. He was thinking about endings, about closure, about one final conversation that might somehow make sense of how thoroughly his life had imploded. He waited outside Iron Rose headquarters on an October evening when the sky looked diseased, greenish-black clouds that seemed to pulse with something alive and malevolent. The air tasted like metal and electricity, like the moment before lightning finds ground. His hands shook, and he told himself it was from cold, even though the temperature was warm, humid, the kind of oppressive heat that comes before storms. He'd rehearsed what he would say 100 times, practiced different approaches, different tones, trying to find the magic combination of words that would somehow undo everything. Stefani exited, flanked by her assistant and Matt Henry, her expression calm and focused until she saw Jacob standing in her path. For just a moment, so brief he almost missed it, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not anger, but something closer to resignation. Like she'd known this confrontation was coming and had already decided how it would end. Security moved immediately, but she raised a hand. Professional, controlled, it's fine. I'll handle this. The rain started. Not gently, but violently, like the sky had been cut open and was bleeding water. Within seconds they were both soaked, but neither moved. Matt stood back, trusting her to manage her own demons, his presence supportive, but not controlling. I needed to talk to you. Jacob's voice already sounded desperate, and he hated himself for it. I know I don't have the right, but I'm asking anyway. You're correct. You don't have the right, but I'm listening. Stefani's voice was steady, unbothered by the rain hammering down, by the wind that was starting to howl like something dying. I've lost everything. The words poured out, rehearsed but sincere, desperate but entitled. My company, my reputation, my mother won't speak to me. I can't find work anywhere. They've blacklisted me. I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong, but isn't this enough? Haven't I been punished sufficiently? Don't I deserve some kind of forgiveness, some kind of closure? Lightning cracked overhead close enough to feel, and thunder followed immediately like the earth was splitting open. The rain was already soaking through his jacket, plastering his hair to his skull, but he didn't move. He needed her to see his suffering, needed her to understand that he'd paid the price. I've apologized 1,000 times in my head, Jacob continued, raising his voice over the storm. I know what I said that night was cruel, but we both made mistakes, didn't we? Marriage is complicated. People say things they don't mean. Can't we find some way past this? Can't you acknowledge that I've suffered enough? That I've learned? That I'm different now? Stefani let him finish. Let the rain soak them both while Matt stood 20 feet back, watching, ready to intervene, but respecting her autonomy. Her face was unreadable, water streaming down it, and Jacob couldn't tell if she was crying or if it was just the rain. He hoped it was tears. That would mean she still felt something, that there was still a crack in her armor he could exploit. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the storm's roar with surgical precision. "Let me make sure I understand what you're asking." Her tone was almost conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. "You want me to forgive you, not because you've learned anything or changed fundamentally, but because you've lost things, and you think suffering is currency that buys absolution. You want closure, not because you want me to heal, but because you're uncomfortable with being the villain in a story that's still being told." "That's not—" "I just thought—" Jacob stumbled over words that wouldn't form properly. "You thought wrong." Stephanie stepped closer, and Jacob instinctively stepped back. "Your suffering isn't my responsibility. Your downfall isn't my satisfaction. It's just consequence meeting cruelty after a 5-year delay. You want to know why your life fell apart? It's because people finally stopped being polite about what they'd always known, that you're someone who treats others as disposable, who values people only for what they provide you, who mistakes cruelty for strength. I loved you." "No." The word came out like a blade. "You loved having someone who made you feel charitable. You loved the story you told yourself about being noble enough to marry beneath your station. You loved my gratitude and my compliance and my willingness to shrink for your comfort. You never loved me. You don't even know what love means." The rain intensified, turning the parking lot into a lake, but neither of them moved. "I rebuilt myself," Stefani continued, her voice somehow getting quieter and more powerful simultaneously. "Not to punish you, but to reclaim everything you tried to take. My dignity, my worth, my right to exist without your permission. You taught me what I didn't want. Life taught me what I deserved. And those are completely different lessons. What am I supposed to do?" Jacob's voice cracked. "How am I supposed to move forward?" "That's not my problem to solve." Stephanie's eyes held no anger, no satisfaction, just a kind of distant finality. "Figure it out the way everyone else does, by being someone worth forgiving instead of someone demanding forgiveness because you're finally uncomfortable." "So that's it? I just have to live with this forever?" "Yes, the same way I had to live with what you did to me. The same way countless people live with the harm others caused. You're not special. You're just finally experiencing what most people navigate daily, the weight of your own choices." She paused, making sure he was listening. "The woman you married died in the rain the night she left, drowned in your cruelty and your mother's contempt. What rose from that drowning doesn't waste time on men who only value what they've lost." Jacob dropped to his knees on that flooded pavement, water rushing around him, rain hammering down so hard it hurt. "Please, I'm begging you, just tell me there's a way back from this." Stefani looked down at him with something that might have been pity if it carried any warmth. "There is a way back. It just doesn't involve me. Learn to be someone different. Become someone who treats people with dignity regardless of what they can provide you. Spend the rest of your life building value instead of extracting it. Maybe then you'll understand that forgiveness isn't something you're owed. It's something you might eventually give yourself when you finally become someone worth forgiving." She turned her back while he was still kneeling, walked to where Matt Henry waited with an umbrella he knew she wouldn't use. "Because some people are baptized in storms, and they come out harder than rain itself." Matt's arm went around her shoulders as they walked toward his car. Not possessive, not controlling, just steady, present in ways that said, "I'm here," without needing words. Jacob remained on his knees in the flooded parking lot, rain hammering down, thunder shaking the ground, watching them disappear into the storm. Security stayed back, letting him kneel there until he finally stood and walked away alone, water rushing around his feet, lightning revealing his path in stuttering flashes. The storm raged all night. The rain destroyed roads and flooded subways and turned the city into something that looked like the world ending. And in a way, it was. The end of Jacob Duffy's delusion that suffering was the same thing as learning. That consequence was the same thing as growth. That being sorry was the same thing as being different. Some storms destroy. Others just wash away the lies you've been telling yourself about who you are and what you deserve. This storm did both. Chapter 10, When the Sky Clears. Victory doesn't announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it looks like a quiet morning in a brownstone kitchen, drinking coffee while rain taps gently on windows. Holding hands with someone who knows your scars and calls them beautiful. Building a life so full of meaning that revenge becomes irrelevant because you're too busy being extraordinary. The grand opening of Iron Rose's flagship, Manhattan store, happened on a crystalline November morning, the kind of day that arrives after storms, when the air smells clean and the light seems to bless everything it touches. The building was a cathedral of accessible elegance, 4 stories of clothing designed for real bodies, real budgets, real lives. Stefani stood at the entrance with Matt, his hand at her back in that now familiar gesture of support without ownership. The press surrounded them, cameras flashing, questions overlapping, everyone wanting to capture this moment when vision became reality. She'd barely slept the night before. Not from anxiety, but from excitement, the kind of energy that comes from knowing you're about to prove every doubter wrong, that you're standing at the culmination of years of work that nearly killed you but didn't. How does it feel to be here? A journalist called out, like breathing after being underwater for years, like proof that what tries to destroy you doesn't get to define you. Stefani's voice was steady, clear. This isn't just a store. It's evidence that you can start with nothing and build something that matters. That being underestimated is sometimes the greatest gift your enemies can give you. That cruelty doesn't win. It just reveals who's worth keeping around. They asked about her journey, and she answered with brutal honesty, about starting with nothing after leaving a marriage that was slowly killing her spirit. About surviving on minimum wage and teaching art to children who needed to know beauty still existed. About the storm that killed 3 people and saved 1 billionaire and somehow changed everything. She spoke about the nights when hunger felt like it would consume her from the inside. About the mornings when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. About the moment she decided that survival wasn't enough. She wanted to thrive. I was drowning in a life that looked perfect from outside but was suffocating me from within. Leaving felt like dying. But sometimes you have to die to who you were to become who you're meant to be. She paused, looked at Matt, then back at the cameras. I didn't build this alone. Matt Henry invested in my vision when the world said I had nothing to offer. The women in Crown Heights and Brownsville supported me when I had no credentials. The children I taught reminded me why creating beauty matters. This success belongs to everyone who believed that worth isn't determined by where you start. It's determined by who you become. Inside the store, the top floor featured a gallery of artwork from the community center children. Every piece was for sale, with proceeds going entirely to the young artists. A painting by the 7-year-old who'd called Stephanie brave sold for $5,000 to a collector who said she was investing in the future. The letters lined an entire wall, thousands of them, from women thanking her for making them feel seen, from young girls who looked at her and believed they could build something from nothing, from survivors of their own hells who said her story gave them permission to stop apologizing for taking up space. Matt stood beside her, and when they looked at each other, it told a story that interviews couldn't capture. 2 people who'd survived their own drownings, finding each other in the aftermath, building something together that honored both their scars and their strength. Across the street, anonymous in the crowd, Jacob watched. He worked now as a junior analyst at a mid-level firm, made enough to survive, but not enough to pretend, lived in a studio where he could hear neighbors through walls like paper. His mother had passed away 6 months earlier. They hadn't spoken in over a year. At her funeral, people asked where he'd been, and he had no answer that didn't sound like confession. Her final words to him, delivered through her attorney after she'd removed him from her will, had been simple and devastating. "I raised a son I was proud of. I don't know who you became." He saw Stefani through the glass, radiant and powerful, surrounded by people who looked at her like she was proof that goodness doesn't finish last, it just takes the long route. Matt Henry stood beside her, and Jacob recognized something in how they looked at each other. Real love, the kind built on respect and survival, and choosing each other every day. The kind of love Jacob had never understood, had never been capable of offering, because he'd been too busy taking to ever learn how to give. That evening, a journalist asked Stefani about revenge. She paused, looked at Matt, then back at the cameras. When she spoke, her voice wasn't rehearsed, it was searching, figuring out the words as she went. Revenge. "People keep asking me about revenge." She shook her head. "I didn't set out to destroy anyone. I needed to survive. And surviving meant building something, creating something that proved, not to him, but to myself, that I wasn't what he said I was. Weak, useless, a mistake." She took a breath, and Matt's hand found the small of her back. "He taught me what I didn't want. That part's true. But life, she gestured to the store, to the people, to everything she'd built. This taught me what I deserved. And it's not about him anymore. Maybe it never really was. It's about every woman who's been told she's not enough. Every person who got discarded and had to figure out how to keep breathing." Her voice caught slightly. "The rain that night, I thought it would kill me. I wanted it to, honestly. But it didn't. It just washed away everything that was already dying. And what was left? I don't know, something stronger. Something that didn't need his permission to exist." She didn't mention his name. She never did. And watching her stand there, imperfect, human, real, was more powerful than any perfect speech could have been. The journalist pressed, "So you're saying it's not revenge?" Stefani smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "No, it's resurrection. And the difference is, resurrection is about you coming back to life. Revenge is about them staying dead. I chose life. What he chose, that was always his choice to make." As she walked out of that opening into a city that finally felt like home, hand in hand with Matt Henry, toward a future she'd built with scarred hands and unbreakable will, Jacob watched from the shadows and finally understood. Some women don't need you to fall. They're too busy learning to fly. The rain that destroyed her didn't kill her. It washed away everything weak and left only what was strong enough to survive the drowning. And what survived was someone he never deserved in the first place. Someone who didn't need his permission to be extraordinary, his approval to be worthy, his presence to be whole. That's not revenge. That's resurrection. And he was standing in the ruins of what he destroyed, finally understanding that the real tragedy isn't that he lost her. It's that he never actually had her at all. He just had proximity to greatness and mistook it for ownership. The rain started again, gentle this time, cleansing. Stefani lifted her face to it and smiled, because rain no longer meant drowning. It meant she survived something that tried to kill her and came out stronger. And Jacob walked away alone, finally learning what poverty really means, not the absence of money, but the absence of meaning. She had everything. He had nothing. And the rain, indifferent and eternal, washed them both toward the futures they'd built with their own hands.